Hello, everybody, and welcome to Two Chapter Two Select, a seasonal podcast where we bounce back and forth between a series exploring their evolution, design, and legacy. For Season 4, we are covering The Fast and the Furious. I am one of your hosts, Max Roberts, and I am joined, as always, by Logan Moore. Hi, Logan.
We hungry.
I was hoping you'd say it. We are hungry.
We hungry.
We're
hungry. Hungry.
Oh,
However he says it.
one of the best lines and deliveries of my life. An
Of your
essential
life?
That quote has been with me for a very long time, Logan. It is
I will say that's
foundational.
probably one of the most well-known quotes from the franchise. I mean, that's one
has to be.
I've known about for a pretty long time, and I've never seen any of these movies. Like, I can't think of any other standout quotes other than "I got family" or whatever.
Yeah, and honestly, your perception of that is really warped by just a video
Memes.
of like 30 men in black tank tops just
And
shouting
shades, all chanting family. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, we hungry and ejecto-ceto cuz are the two things I definitely knew about before we watched this movie.
Both quotes from Roman. Says a lot about his character.
It does.
Oh, I'm so excited. This is one of my favorites in the series.
Well, I think you might be alone on that island based on some of the other responses here, which we'll get to. Let's run down the basic information about Too Fast, Too Furious before we get into talking about the movie at large. This film released 2 years after the original on June 6, 2003. It was directed by John Singleton, produced again by Neal H. Moritz. The writers were Gary Scott Thompson, Michael Brandt, and Derek Haas. Michael Brandt and Derek Haas specifically wrote the script. The primary actors this time around were Paul Walker once again. Tyrese Gibson joined the cast, alongside Chris Ludacris Bridges, Eva Mendes, and Cole Hauser as this very bad villain. The composer was different this time around, as David Arnold joined the team to make the music for this. The stunt coordinator was Artie Meleshi, I think. And the sequel had a much higher budget this time around, about double of the previous movie's budget, with $76 million, and it made $236 million worldwide. It wasn't as well received, though. Rotten Tomatoes, the critics gave this one a 36% overall score, and the fans didn't do much better. They gave it a 50% user score, which, again, Rotten Tomatoes is somewhat newer-ish within the past decade or so, so these scores are kind of retroactive.
Mm-hmm.
But still, this has got to be one of the lowest rated in the series, I would imagine.
I wanted to read this quote from Roger Ebert of the Chicago Sun-Times. Let's see. He gave the film a 3 out of 4 and said, "It doesn't have a brain in its head, but it's made with skill and style, and boy, it is fast and furious." Thanks, Roger.
The movie critic of all movie critics said he liked it, so
Yeah.
what does that say about this movie?
In Roger, we trust. Was it double the budget? Holy smokes, it was.
Yeah, it was double the budget, because the last one was like, what, 38 million, I think?
Yeah, I just looked
So
it
it was
up.
exactly double the budget. Let's talk about our own histories with this. Max, you have much more of a history with this than I do, at least. Actually, I do have somewhat of a history, which we talked about a little bit.
I'm excited to hear about the story of your grandfather going to see Too Fast, Too Furious.
No, I don't think he saw Too Fast, Too Furious. But this was the first one you saw in the series, right?
It was. This is the very first Fast and Furious movie I saw, and from this moment on, I was hooked, sold. I've seen everything since multiple times. I was at my
Hold on, can I ask when you went back and watched the first one after you saw this?
sometime. It would have been sometime probably in middle school. It wasn't an immediate go back because I didn't get in trouble, but my aunt and uncle got in trouble for letting me and my brother watch this movie. So we're at our aunt and uncle's house with our cousins and them there. I guess my parents were out on a date or doing work or something. I don't know. I really have no idea what they were doing that night. But they had rented Too Fast, Too Furious from Blockbuster, and we all sat down and watched it. This movie is PG-13. In 2003, I would have been 9. My brother was...
You would have just turned 9, or would you have turned 9 yet?
I would have, because, well, that's the theater. So Running from Blockbuster was later in the year.
True.
So we were 9 and 7 at the time, and fairly sheltered. And so when my parents came and picked us up and had heard that we had watched this movie, probably out of our own mouths because it was so cool and just this awesome movie, I do vividly remember my parents being upset at them and kind of an argument between adults about this over the amount of language in the film and the
Which probably just made
scene.
you think it was even cooler.
It did. It probably definitely cemented it even more in my mind. So we did have to close our eyes for the torture scene, which
Yes.
I was telling you that is just cemented in my brain and actually still has like some level of tension, even though there is clear corniness and just an elevation of evil very quickly there. There's still some seated, what is the word I'm looking for? Disturbance, like tension with the scene.
Gives you a certain emotional
response.
feelings.
And probably because we were told to close our eyes, but we could still hear it, which I think adds to the stress and horror of it all. But that was the first one, and I've been watching these movies ever since. I love this movie. And definitely, mostly probably for a blind nostalgia, just a warm feeling, associated with it, because it is one of the weaker entries for sure.
And it's something you watched when you were a kid, so that's going to automatically give you those rose-tinted glasses when looking back at it. For me, I don't have a very extensive history with this movie. I talked last time about my grandfather and his whole experience with the first movie, and I do remember that. For the sequel, though, the only thing I really remember is just that this franchise was like gaining popularity. I remember kids at school talking about this. I remember being on Cordova Drive, going to West Newton Elementary School in Decatur, Indiana, Decatur Central. And I remember some kids in school. One kid, I think on my bus, was wearing like a Too Fast, Too Furious shirt at one point. He's like, yeah, this is the best movie ever. I saw it the other day, blah, 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 blah. And just going, I remember kids talking about this movie because it was like catching on finally with people our age, like yourself, for example. Like you saw this and you thought it was awesome and it was really cool. Like I was at that age of adolescence where if you saw quote unquote like adult movies or whatever, you thought they were like automatically the coolest thing you'd ever seen. Like Spider-Man, when I saw the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies, like those were not, that was completely different, from going to see Shrek or these movies that I knew were being made for me or made for children. And again, I did not see Too Fast, Too Furious, but I think that was just a common feeling amongst anybody in my age group, is that if you got to see real adult movies like The Fast and the Furious, you thought it was so cool.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember it gaining steam with some people I went to school with. I don't have like specific memories of certain like friends I had back then watching it or talking about it, but I just remember like broadly like people wearing shirts with Fast and Furious logo and cars on it, and people talking about how they had seen it and rented it from Blockbuster, things of that nature.
Yeah.
So this is when it really started to become apparent in culture, I guess, for me.
At least at your age, that it was definitely.
At least at my age, it's when I started to. Again, I knew about the other movie, like I said, because of the whole exposure via my grandfather in the strangest way. But this is when I started realizing that people actually like these movies and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Or at least people in my age, because again, this has like a 50% on Rotten Tomatoes. And
well, maybe part of that is my cousins are older than me by a couple of years, and then the sister is also older, even still. And so I wonder if
you didn't pass them in age?
No, I've never passed them. I meant it's Jake and then Allison, and so they were old enough to see this movie, and so probably there's a level of maybe older siblings that were seeing this movie that then took their younger ones to see it, and it's just trickled down in the age range. And kids in school, when the younger siblings or the younger people catch on to what the older kids are doing, that even amplifies the coolness even more. So I probably was like, this is the greatest movie ever, because cars are flying and jumping and all sorts of stuff.
Yeah.
And it probably was, they were all like, this is probably fine.
It's funny you mentioned that. I mean, this is kind of a total aside, but that's kind of how I got into Zelda, of all things. I was at some babysitter's house, and she had a kid that was in high school, I believe, at the time. And I went over there one morning and was being watched by this lady, and her son came down, and like before school, he's like, oh, I'm going to play some video games before I go to school today. And he came downstairs and he played Zelda. And I thought Zelda looked cool in general, but its coolness factor was like amplified that much more because this older kid was playing this Nintendo game. I'm like, this game is cool. This game is for grown-ups. This game is, yeah, I want to play this now myself. And then the next time I went to the store and my parents were like, oh, we'll let you get a game. I was like, cool, I want that one. Because I knew what it was. And
Exactly.
and so it was, yeah, I don't know, just strange exposure to buying these things comes from, or your enjoyment of things when you're a kid, I guess, comes from who exposes you to it, especially if it's older kids that you kind of look up to. So in 2022, though, we're both 28-year-old men. What did you think in a general sense about this before we start breaking it down too much further?
I mean, I fully admit I'm biased here. I love it. I think this movie is just fun. It's interesting, especially in the context of the greater series, which you'll obviously kind of peel back. A lot of characters are introduced here, and it's just fun to see the origins of people like Tej and Roman, and know where they go and how it all started here. There's just there's almost a grassroots kind of energy to it, and obviously it's a sequel to the movie at the time. The vision of where this was all going wasn't there in 2002 and stuff when this movie was being made, but there is this kind of up and coming energy to it. And I noticed this time around, the coming off of watching Fast 1 and now Too Fast, street racing played a bit more of a narrative role. It wasn't just race wars and the
It wasn't
occasional
drag
street race.
racing in particular. It was actually like racing around town. Yeah.
Circuits and tracks and things like that. So I appreciated that effort, especially since we will quickly depart at the importance of racing here in the overall franchise. Like, racing cars are still important.
Post-Tokyo Drift,
yeah,
especially.
Yeah, so racing is going to lose its importance here, especially since our order is chronological narratively. You know, the next movie you and I are going to be watching here is Fast and Furious, which you'll notice the racing decline. So it was cool to see that here. In general, my bias sends it through the roof, but I enjoy this movie. It's definitely an okay, if not solid, sequel.
Yeah, I think, again, this being my first exposure to all of these, I think this is definitely the weaker of the two I've seen so far. But I did not hate it. But I think, even though I didn't watch this as a kid, I'm still very much nostalgic for this time period and for movies from this time period. So there's like a certain sort of comfort in watching something like this that emulates or has the same sort of style of movies that I grew up with. There's just something within me that likes watching this. That being said, I don't think the story is very good or compelling this time around. I think the movie lives and dies by its characters. Paul Walker and Tyrese continue to be very good, but everybody else in the cast, I think, kind of stinks. Tej is okay, but I don't really think he even has a whole lot to work with because he's just not in it a ton. It's actually
he's in more than Ja Rule.
He is in it more than Ja Rule, but I feel like even Suki got more screen time than him in a lot of ways because she's primarily involved in one of the in the big opening scene with the race. So she gets a little bit more
racing, yeah.
So she gets a little bit more maybe not characterization, but she gets more lines and she's more involved in some fun stuff like that. And Ludacris's character is just kind of on the side, like, yeah, I organize all this. So like, I don't feel like even he really stood out too much. And we could talk about this more as we go through the story, the problems that I had with it. But I mean, broadly, the villain's bad. I think Eva Mendes' character is pointless, like very, very pointless. Like it's clearly it's clear that they're just like, let's throw in a potential love interest for Paul Walker, but then that doesn't even really materialize in any sort of way. And but yeah, Tyrese steals the show in this movie. Tyrese and Paul Walker, their budding bromance is like the core of the movie, and that's why you want to watch it, and that's why it's good. And I think they really save it, just their back and forth constantly throughout the movie. There's a lot of good one-liners in this that are good because they're bad. Like the script in this movie, like there's so many awkward lines, but it's the way that they deliver them with like conviction more often than not. Like, yeah, somebody really would say this. That's really funny. Like it makes her an odd dynamic.
It is definitely carried by performance, specifically, like you said, Paul Walker and Tyrese. They carry this whole movie on their backs together, and their dynamic is so strong. It's part of why, Tyrese comes back in later films and is in the series going forward from that point. And while the two of them were together while Paul was still alive, their chemistry has always been solid, and it started here. I think they're playing off of each other is the best part of this movie, hands down.
Yeah, I think the one thing I wanted to mention too before we dive too deep into the story is it's also weird that Dom and them are not in this, at least not even... Like, they're mentioned, obviously, but I don't even think they say Dominic Toretto. This is his name.
They don't mention him by name.
Maybe they do. Maybe they do once. Maybe they're at the opening, but I can't remember. But yeah, they don't mention Dom and them, which is funny within the larger scope of the series. It's funny given that we talked about at the end of the last episode that Fast 1 had a post-credit scene, and it shows Dom driving around there in the desert. And then they cut to this movie and he's just nowhere to be seen whatsoever. And obviously the reason he's not in it is behind the scenes stuff. Like, I don't know if we mentioned this at the top. We were talking about it before the show when we started recording, at least. Vin just didn't come back because he didn't like the script. He was also committed to filming Chronicles of Riddick at the time. This was probably Vin Diesel's biggest stretch of hit films. He had Fast 1, Triple X, Chronicles of Riddick, and then The Pacifier, like all in successive years, like back to back to back to back to back. That was probably the biggest stretch of his entire career, because nowadays he comes out of his hole to do the latest Fast movie and say, I am Groot, and I feel like that's about it. But in the early 2000s, he was in quite a few different things. So it seems like scheduling and a mix of him just not thinking that they had a good idea for the sequel led to him being written out in that manner, which is kind of funny in retrospect.
Yes.
Because again, they at this point, they didn't know that this was going to be this huge, sprawling 10, 11 film franchise or whatever. So
it also stands, because of these circumstances, how they bring it all back together is, I'm excited for you to see that, because there has to be a remergence, like not remergence.
They have to combine.
They have to merge it all back together. And Tokyo Drift is also involved.
I was going to say, obviously, I know broad things that happen in the future. They got to bring them all together. Then they got to bring in, I know, like Han, for instance, is in Tokyo Drift, and then he ends up joining the main crew at some point, and then #Justice for Han or something. That's a thing I know about.
It's so fun to see you experience this in a weird way.
There are like broad things I know. There are broad beats of the series that I know about. But yeah, it's funny just the way we're even watching them. Like, I think we talked, I mean, typically on our show, we do the whole bounce back and forth thing and go from one end of the chronological spectrum to the other. And with this, we're kind of watching them sequentially, but I think it's almost more fascinating in some ways to watch them sequentially, because you see how they developed into this mega. We're not even watching it sequentially, we're watching it in chronological order from the time period in the films, but it's still fascinating to see them develop in that sort of way.
You buckle up, buddy. You're in for a ride here for sure.
Let's run through the story of Too Fast, Too Furious a bit more and break down some of the key things from it and what we thought. The movie obviously opens showing Brian's back, introduces Tej Parker, who's his friend who organizes a bunch of street races. There's a street race to open the movie, which is a fun sequence to kind of get things off on the right foot. I don't know if you have anything to say about that. Just the way the scene was shot. There's a lot more CG in this movie compared to the first one, and I think that's very clear from the jump here. And it's almost to obviously it's not aged super well because this movie is now 20 years old or so, or just about. So that's a little bit distracting, but they do a good mix of, I think, the camera work throughout. I mean, not only just this opening sequence, but all the different racing sequences in the movie. I think it's a good mix of practical stuff, CG, and then the camera work, like going in and out of the cars and stuff like that and bouncing between the different cars. I think the way that it's shot and these scenes are cut together is still really well done for the most part.
I agree. It's an interesting balance. They definitely use CG more, bigger budget, so it allowed for them to do more ambitious things, and they definitely do, both practically and on the computer. So it's cool to see that evolve, because we're about to have a leap in significantly in the budget. And so you're going to see that exponentially increase. And this is a bit more gradual. This is kind of a logical next step for how they do that. There was one shot in this movie that actually really caught me as really cool this time around that I hadn't noticed before. It's early on when they get the yellow and the purple car. I don't remember specifically what they are, but Eva Mendes Monica rides with Brian and Roman. They're off to go to Verone's house, and it's on Roman's side of the car, and it goes up in between the two cars and then around to Monica's side of the car, like this kind of S-shaped camera movement. It's very fluid and fast, and obviously they use CG to do the transition, but it's so convincing and a fluid one shot to get there. It's a cool effect, and they do that throughout. There's different shots from up above, up close, inside the car, outside the car. I think they use a lot of it fairly well, and it's still shot on film, so there's a texture to it that gives it a tangible feel as well this time around.
Yeah, and like I said, the way the scenes are all cut together too is sometimes jarring, but for the most part, I think they do a pretty decent job with it, and they use the cuts that they're making to build up that tension during these sequences. Like, I think more about the one later in the movie where they're being chased by the cops and stuff like that, and there's some good editing in that sequence, I think, for the most part. The crux of this movie's plot, though, is that it introduces the villain Carter Verone, who is somebody that Brian's former bosses, Agent Bilkins, who was in the first movie, is back, and he's trying to get Paul Walker, or I guess Brian O'Connor, to come back and help out the police once again to track down this Carter fellow. He
sells drugs. He's a drug lord.
He sells drugs, but the way that they kind of intro that he's also like involved with street racing and things like that is kind of like wonky. Like, they're like, oh, we need to take down this drug lord, blah, 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 blah. Also, he's got street racers and stuff like that, and he wants to use you guys for work. It's just the way in which they are saying that he can infiltrate this guy's like inner circle is very odd, and it doesn't make much sense, but you just kind of nod your head and you're like, okay, sure, we'll go with this. They've also got what's her name, Eva Mendes' character, is it Monica Fuentes? Yeah. She's already dispatched and is kind of an inside person working undercover for Carter, and that really goes nowhere. But yeah, Brian ends up going and getting Roman, his old friend, back from California. He enlists his help. Then they go back to Miami, and they're kind of on uneasy terms with one another, and they agree to do this deal.
They start in Miami, then they have to go all the way back to California just to get Roman. And then they go
Yes.
all the way back to Miami. So there are 2 6-hour plane trips.
Yeah. That's I would not want to do that personally because I do not like flying in the slightest. But it doesn't really establish either that they go to California. It kind of like
Well, all they do is say Barstow.
Yeah, it does, but not. It doesn't make it like super clear that that's where they're at. Because he just says, "Oh, I know somebody," and then the next scene it cuts and they're in the demolition derby. But Roman and him, like we said before, is them two being from the jump. Those two being together is really the core of the movie. Him and Roman have the best lines, the best scenes with one another, and really it's everybody else around it is kind of, not so much. Let's talk about Carter and Monica as characters, because they're the 2 weak points I think of this for me. Carter's just rich dude, drug lord, typical cookie cutter movie villain in a lot of ways, and I think that's his biggest undoing. We also talked before about the scene with the rat, and that whole sequence of 5 minutes there is really just meant to amplify his evilness and remind you, oh yeah, he's evil. And it's done so in such an awkward way. Or maybe not awkward, but they just really throttle it up very quickly. Like, oh, you don't think this guy is that evil?
I was going to say they just punch the pedal. They just put it to the pedal to the metal there.
We're going to have a rat chew through this man. And also he's going to threaten to kill his girlfriend that he doesn't know is a cop yet. And so they just really make him like a cartoonishly evil very, very quickly and suddenly within a span of like 10 minutes. Which is fine, I guess, but it's just done so abruptly, and you can tell from a scriptwriter perspective, like what they're doing, like, oh, we need to establish that this guy is not to be trifled with and that he very much is evil. And it just seems very out of nowhere in some respects.
I think a difficult part of it is his acts of villainy, his, drug dealing and things like that, is all separate from him. You never see him commit the crime or talk about the crime, except for the rat torture scene in particular. And I get that is also the issue that the cops are having, that they can't put him and the crime together, which is why they need to find this money and put him and the money together so that they can arrest him properly and stuff. But he's just talked about as a bad dude, and he gives off a corny, you described it as like a mustache twirl kind of villainy, like,
yes.
And I think that's part of the weakness is we never see him. The movie, he is just not doing anything bad. He's just described as the villain, and then suddenly it ramps to, I will torture cops and kill my girlfriend. So this gets caught. And you still never see the drugs. You do see 6 duffel bags of money, but that's it. And so there's just a disassociation between the crime and the person that I don't think ever really ends up connecting. We're just supposed to accept him as the bad guy, and that's it.
I think the thing that, if they wanted to make him come across as more like legitimately evil, or they wanted to maybe ratchet up the viewer's tension towards him as the antagonist, they could have levied even Mendes' character Monica a little bit more tactfully in this way. I think her being an undercover cop makes no sense. I think that you could remove that element of the plot and it would be totally fine, because if they could have just established it to where Roman and Brian go to this dude's compound, they meet her, and maybe her and Brian kind of have a connection right away, and they get to know each other a little bit, and then you find out the reason she's all flirty with him is because she's in an abusive relationship with him, and he's horrible to her, and she feels like she can't leave him because he's obviously threatens her in this movie. Like, what point of her and then she could still later in the movie go off and tip him off and be like, hey, this is happening, I need to let you know this. Like, her being a cop really plays no role in this movie's story.
It does give her and Brian a point to relate on specifically. They both were undercover cops, and Brian does understand what that can do to you. And it does, they say in the movie, it makes Brian go native, when he gives Dom the keys and stuff. So there is that connection there. And like, will she, quote unquote, go native, and will she turn on them?
But I think her being a cop, there's this plot thread throughout the movie involving her where they're like, she's been compromised, she's with him now, and like it is implied like, no, they are very much together and they are a couple, but she's still undercover. And it's like, so they introduce this element of can we trust Monica? Is she a trustworthy person? Has she really been compromised by this relationship that she has with Carter, which is clearly now romantically tied to him? And they really never do anything with that. The only way they explain it away is just her going to Brian later and being like, oh, you're in trouble. So that's just kind of their way of showing like, oh, she's not really compromised by her relationship with him. She's still going to do her job and is still going to look out for Brian and Roman. But at the same time, why are you romantically involved with this guy? Like, it's a very strange thing that they don't ever really explain in any manner.
And the only person that doesn't trust her is Roman, because he just doesn't trust cops. But Paul never doubted her.
But it's such
I'm not saying it's strong.
It's such a weird thought process from the police's perspective too. Like, hey, go off and become sexually involved with this crime lord so that we can.
I don't think Undercover ever starts out as become sexually involved.
But like, that's what it was in this movie. Like, how was she supposed to infiltrate his inner circle? Like, that's the other thing. They don't really ever explain how she was embedded within this group. They're just like, oh yeah, we have an inside person. It's her. And then when you see what her role is, it's just, I'm his girlfriend. So it's not like she is ever shown to really do anything for the organization. It's just, she just sits around his mansion and is his girlfriend, and she gives out a couple orders there in the one scene, like, everybody give us your licenses or whatever. And that's about it. She does nothing else.
Yeah, her like actual police work side of it is not really explored because the movie is focusing on Brian and Roman. I
just don't think she just didn't need to be a cop. I think if she's not a cop, it would have hit that much harder. Maybe not that much harder, but I think it would have. I think the script would have still worked. That you could have had her and Brian. The key important things of her character is that she has a connection with Brian. She tells Brian and Roman and warns them when Carter's going to try to kill them later, and that's about the only important things she does. And I think you could have still had her do that, not as a cop. Like it just feels a little strange.
I do think it robs.
I don't understand her character.
I do think it robs of the shared ground between it. Truly, then just does make her an object of attraction. I'm not saying, but I feel like she's that's this what great she moving is character, but
I mean, I feel like that's what she kind of is in the first place in this movie. They're just like, who's a hot chick we could put in this movie, and because they've got plenty of scenes with her wearing crop tops or sitting by the pool in a bikini.
Sure.
So they've got plenty of shots of Eva Mendes just looking hot in this movie as she is. She's pretty good looking in this movie. Give her credit. Good job, Ryan Gosling. But yeah, away from her, I guess, and away from Carter, what else is there to break down with? I guess, do you have anything to say about the cops in this movie?
I like Bilkins returning. He's good comedic relief on the police side of the plot. That's really it.
The other guy from, was it Customs, the customs agent that is going at it with Roman the whole movie?
Markham, Agent Markham.
Yeah, him and Roman going at it is kind of not that interesting. They try to make this tension between the two of them, but it's never really all that, I don't know. Roman just straight up tries to blast him. He says, so anyway, I started firing with his gun.
It's a great scene to maintain the cover, though. It's fun, it's tense, and reveals that their cars are being GPS tracked as well. So,
but yeah, the cops. I feel like Bilkins feels like he's really just comedic relief. Like the scene comes to my mind where he's eating popcorn as he watches them fight in front of the trailer. There, really don't do too much throughout the movie. Other than that, a lot of the other scenes in the movie don't really. I will give this movie credit that it incorporates quite a few different racing scenes and different like there's a lot of scenes in this movie that do involve cars running around and racing, far more than the last movie, which felt like it was just the big kind of, there was a scene at the end where they jump in front of the train, obviously, and then there's the scene with the semi in the previous film. Other than that, this movie has the opening race sequence. It's got the race sequence later when they race for slips. It's got the scene where they're running from the cops. It's got the big scene later with all the hundreds of cars running around all over the place.
The job application race where they have to go to the boatyard.
Yep.
And they're all different types of races as well. One is a straight up circuit in the opening. One is, down and back tag team style. One is, first to destination. One is escaping cops. So they fit.
One is ejecto-ceto cuz, which leads to jumping onto a boat.
Yeah, so they use racing and different types of races, I think, effectively. And each one has impact on the narrative. It's not like Race Wars where Letty racing someone, that doesn't have any impact on the plot.
Yeah. And again, even that is just them drag racing in a straight line, and she hits the nos, and that's about it. So I think this movie actually has pretty decent pacing, because despite all the problems I was mentioning with like Carter not being a great villain and Monica being somewhat of a pointless character, and like between Roman and Brian's good back and forth and their banter throughout the whole movie, that combined with the fact that you're getting like a new racing action scene of some sort every probably like 15 to 20 minutes, I feel like the movie goes really fast and it's got a good sort of pace to it. Yeah. So I in that regard, I didn't really feel like it was ever dragging, or the things that I do have the biggest problem with the movie weren't constantly put in front of my face.
There's also, we forgot to mention the most important race, jet skis.
There is a jet ski scene briefly for like 2 seconds in the background. I almost didn't mention that, actually. Tej is a racer of all sorts, apparently. Or he's a
circuit man.
He's a circuit man of all sorts, even if those circuits are on the water.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess the only other thing to really mention would be the sort of climax scenes in particular, if you want to touch on those. The scene where they are running away and then the hundreds of cars spill out of the garage thanks to the help of Tej and all the local street racers.
The scramble.
Yes, the big scrambling sequence of all the cars. And then we've got the scene where they do jump onto the boat, which I know is amazing. The biggest climax of the film. We were talking when we were watching, like the scene of them all spilling out of the garage it's not that crazy to watch. It's more just crazy how they shot it. Like, yes. I wonder how much coordination that took to where you're not running into one another. And they're driving pretty, like, moderately quickly. Like, it didn't look like they were, like, inching along there going 5 miles an hour. Like, they're kind of zipping around just a tad bit. But, yeah, that was impressive. And I wonder what that was like to shoot.
It's one of the moments... Oh, look, there's how we got the cars and how it was filmed. I might watch that later. This is kind of I think the power of practicality. It's convincing. It's energetic. Later on in the movies, there are plenty of scenes with lots of cars that are all CG, and it pulls you out, definitely. And you'll know what we'll talk about it when we get there. But this is just... it's a good bait and switch. You don't necessarily know where Brian and Roman and
they've set up a plan of some sort with Tej.
Right.
Like they established that beforehand, but you don't know what that entails.
It's cool to see it play out because it is a part of this whole chase. We've gone to the trailer park. We've taken the money out. The cop has rescinded his word, and now the cops are chasing them, the local PD with customs kind of following. So there's that whole chase, which is fun. A good cop chase in movies is a good time. Then the scramble, so now we've got this bait and switch going on.
Yeah.
And then later we learn that it's not the airfield. So Verone has lied to or leaked information to find kind of who the mole is. So there's that tension of where are we going, which then leads into this whole boat. And I think it's a good ramping of the final set piece, as it were. Kind of the whole set piece is kind of chunks. You could even think of it, I'm just going to say it because I've played these games a lot. It's almost like a big Uncharted set piece overall of a level where it's, look at Libertal or in the Madagascar. It's like, we've got to climb up. Oh, the bell fell. Now we've got a puzzle kind of piecing. Now there's the shootout. And then there's the truck chasing us. And then we swing on the rope and now we're being dragged by the truck. And then the motorcycle part, like it ramps, right? And I think this is similar in that way of it. It ramps at an appropriate pace and ends with a very cool scene of a boat flying or a car flying onto a boat.
You've got Brian falling out of his car, driving with the tip of his tip of his toes on his Converse,
of his toes,
keeping the gas down while the guy he's driving with says he can't drive.
Yes, it's well done, I think.
I do think the funniest part about the boat jump at the end, which we talked about a bit, is that they jump onto the boat and it smashes onto the boat, and Carter jumps up with the shotgun and they shoot him, and then that's the end of it. And the only reason I think that's funny is because in most other movies, like if this was a James Bond movie or any other action sequence, John Wick, something like that, jumping onto the boat would only be part one of that whole sequence, and then you'd have them jump out of the car and it'd lead to a huge shootout scene of some sort on the boat. But nope, this is Fast and Furious. It starts and ends with the cars at least, and so once the jump is done, we have a quick little shootout there real fast, and then it's kind of just that's it. That's all we really need to see. This is not a film.
De-escalates it very quickly.
Yeah, this is not a film where you're going to see Brian jump out of the car and proceed to take down 5 henchmen and Carter doing all kinds of karate moves and shooting and stuff like that. It was very much just, nope, here's the car flying through the air and it smacks onto this yacht and that's all we got for you. Which I kind of appreciated it. I was really expecting that scene to go on much longer, and it really did not. It was done after that. Movie obviously wraps up, suggests that Roman and Brian are going to be sticking together, which seems like it's setting up how they'll come back together with Dom later on. Roman clears his name and gets on the good side of the cops by giving them all the money, sort of. He keeps some of it for themselves.
Pockets ain't empty, cuh.
They agree to stay in Miami, and then Eva Mendes stares back at Brian longingly for some reason. The thing I'm most interested in seeing is that I already asked you this, and you already told me that she shows back up in some of the later movies, or at least one of them. And I'm just curious to see what that one is and how she shows back up, or if it's just a cameo appearance of some sort, which is kind of what my guess would be. I don't think she would be majorly involved in any of the plots of the future films, but hey, I don't know. She might just show up for fun at some point. But you told me she's in one of the future movies, and I'm curious to see what that looks like, because she is such a forgettable character in this movie, to be honest.
Yeah. I'm excited for you to see how she's brought back in, and the other characters as well, specifically Tej and Roman.
Yeah.
This movie feels like an isolation, a side story, as it were. But what's important is who comes out of it. And that's, I think, one of the best parts of this. It's just,
It sets up Roman very, very well. Like if Roman is like, you mentioned to me before we started watching this, like, oh, you're going to meet more family members. If the point of this film is to just simply grow the cast of characters that will then be part of the larger family that we see in the latter 5 or 6 movies in the franchise where things get really explosive, then that's fine. And I think as like a character intro for Roman, this movie is good. Like it's a fairly strong character intro film for him. Tej, not so much. I don't think he's bad, but I just think he doesn't get a lot to do, really. He's just this guy who owns a garage and this guy who organizes all these races and helps organize the whole car scramble thing at the end. He's just somebody that Brian just sort of goes to for help every now and then, and that's about it. He doesn't get a whole lot to do otherwise.
You'll see how his role expands, obviously, in the future.
Yeah.
The overall plot-wise, like, it is forgettable, sure, especially
the
Carter.
plot itself is not great, but that's kind of what I mentioned, is like they do a good job of distracting you from the plot and the pointlessness of why is this character in this, or why is this happening, or why is this going on. They distract you with that constantly by dropping in these car racing sequences or action set pieces or whatever, and some of those don't always make the most sense, or they seem a little bit forced. The one I think about the most is when they're like, our cars are being tracked, well, we gotta race for new cars then. Like, that's a little goofy. That scene feels a little bit forced in particular,
but it's fun.
But yeah, it's
a good race that has some artificial tension.
Yes.
With, we're in the back, so how are we gonna win? And creative driving. He shows Brian in sort of a creative and leadership role between the two of them. Definitely has his head on a bit more straight than Roman. The pace is good. It's fun, which, I think is very important for all of these movies, is a level of fun. And the setting, the cars, it's all wrapped up. And again, I definitely have a bias for sure as the first one I've seen, but I think it's a good movie. Not the best, but it is good. And if it was on TV, I'd sit and watch it. Like, it's got this fun, just like, breezy feel to it. Kind of like Miami.
I don't know if I'd say good, but I wouldn't say it's bad either. And I don't know if I'd say it's like fine. I don't know. It's like a hair below good, I guess. I don't know if I would say it's good enough for me to like rewatch this movie multiple times over for years to come, but I didn't hate it by any means. So I think it's just sort of.
It's definitely not something you want to like. Too Fast, Too Furious. Like, we gotta watch it. It's like,
and I thought that's how it would be, if I'm being honest. That's kind of what I was expecting.
I'm glad to hear that.
Based on all the responses.
You do have this fresh perspective of kind of, you can better age how something like this is. You can better gauge how something like this is aged. Yeah. I can't. And to hear you say that it wasn't as bad as you had feared, it comes to me as very positive that maybe I'm not as crazy as I've.
Again, though, like I said before, I think some of that is very much rose-tinted glasses, not for this movie, but for this era of movies. Like, it is, there's like a certain level of comfort. When I watch this, I'm like, oh, this reminds me of a lot of the movies I was watching when I was 10 years old. So there's like,
yeah,
they don't make them like this anymore.
They don't, that's for sure.
Let's talk a little bit more. I think we've naturally touched on a lot of things. The stunts and the effects used in the movie, the CGI and stuff like that. I think we touched on a lot of that. I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to say. Again, it's kind of awkward how they splice in some of the CG cars sometimes, but I think there's a sort of flow to those sequences to where it never feels too like you're watching a video game.
Yeah.
And even then when they do, I think the opening scene is the one where it is the most readily apparent, with the opening race around the city. And that's not like, that's just for fun. Like, that's just the opening scene of the movie to just kind of get things going. So it's not so distracting that you feel like it's pulling you out of the experience or pulling you out of the movie. It's just there for the heck of it, sort of. So
yeah, I'd agree. I think we've touched on all that.
Editing, yeah, that kind of goes the same thing, the way they splice all of it together. I did want to, let's also touch on the music, the sound design, and all that good stuff here. Anything about this soundtrack really stand out to you? Again, I think the licensed music that's used is, again, it's just nostalgic for that time period. I
this
do think
soundtrack is amazing.
The opening Too Fast, Too Furious themes song that they have is also pretty great.
Act a Fool. What was the other one in here? Too Fast, Too Furious. It's just very good use of that kind of time. It's definitely one of the movies and soundtracks of the times. Like, what rappers can we get to just make a soundtrack that goes with this movie? And obviously it stars Ludacris, so Ludacris is on quite a few tracks in this. And you'll this is also sort of a theme going forward, more so a single in movies. But the soundtracks become part of the identity of future films. And there are the singles that really break through, a lot of the Wiz Khalifa ones in kind of the middle of the series here. So while I don't really remember the Fast and Furious soundtrack all that well, Too Fast, Too Furious is definitely a piece of that time. And there are some songs on here that I still enjoy today. Now, am I listening to this every day? No, but
driving around town listening to Act a Fool.
Yeah, no, not me. But when these songs come on in the movie, I get excited, and that is definitely just piece of
the
that
soundtrack.
time.
The soundtrack has a lot of interesting people on it. It's got Ludacris, obviously, like you mentioned, but then it's also got 2 Chainz, R. Kelly, Tyrese is on a song, Joe Budden. We've got Chingy,
President.
We've got Fat Joe. We've got Pitbull does one of the tracks. Yeah, some Miami representation in there for Mr. Worldwide himself. So there's a lot of people in this soundtrack that are very much, it's a good mix of people, especially hip hop wise, that you would think about with that early 2000s era for sure. So yeah, again, it just kind of, I don't have any love for any of the specific songs in this movie by any means, but it just warm feelings for that era and reminds me of what I was hearing on the radio or what people were into that I was going to school with as a kid and stuff like that. Right. I think that's largely it for the main pillars of the movie, unless there's anything else you can think of that we're forgetting here. I know we're going to do our best car.
I think that's I think best car is where we're at.
All right, then let's do it. The best car in the movie. This is something that we have decided to do here with all of these episodes throughout this season. And it's very straightforward. What is the best car in this film, Max? There is more cars in this movie for sure.
More,
or at least more standout cars.
Yes, standout for sure. Absolutely. Way more iconic designs. But again, this is fairly locked and loaded for me. And if you're looking at the podcast art for this particular episode, you already know what my favorite car is. It is the 1999 Nissan Skyline GTR. In the beginning of the movie, it's Brian's car. It's silver and blue with some blue underlights. This car is awesome.
What happens to this? Do they establish that? Or I guess he just gets arrested, doesn't he? And maybe...
Yeah, I guess arrested and in the impound lot. I will say that I had a little RC car, the micro machines that you could like customize and change little parts out and stuff. And we had some Fast and Furious like body kits that would go over the top. I did have the Supra, the Toyota Supra, the brown one. I had that shell, but the Skyline is absolutely my favorite car in this movie. I think it's definitely the best. What about you? What do you think?
It's kind of a toss-up because I like a lot of the old school cars for sure, which I know is weird to say because we've got a lot of these cars are identifiable with this era. I like the 1970 Dodge Challenger that is used, one of the ones that they race for slips with.
Yes.
The orange one, I believe.
It is.
It's a really cool looking car. I like old school Challengers. But I do have to agree the coolest one is definitely the 1999 Nissan Skyline. That car is very... When you see it whipping around the corners there in the opening scene, and then they gave him the coolest car of the bunch, I believe, in that opening sequence. And I don't know what it is about it that I like so much. Obviously, you got the blue racing stripes on it and stuff like that. But it's kind of duller compared to the other ones. But it's just, I think it really is those blue underlights that really make it pop in that scene that it's in.
It's the silver, the spoiler, all that stuff really sells it for me. This has just got...
It matches Paul Walker's eyes very well.
Mm-hmm. It's just got a good energy to it, and I think it looks slick on the road. It's fun. It's his personality through and through. I love this car so much.
Yeah, it's definitely the best one. I'm with you. Last thing, let's talk about the legacy of this film before we wrap up here and close out. where do you think this movie? What do you think this movie's legacy is nowadays? We talked about how the first one was very much just the starting point for the franchise, and if that was the starting point, then what is this one's legacy? And you can speak to the larger franchise. I cannot, obviously, at this point.
The legacy is Brian and Roman and Tej. That's the obvious answer, because they are the only ones that are carrying through forward. And then Monica as well. She's also in the future. So that's the legacy of this film in a broader sense. Personally, it's the movie that started the Fast and Furious for me. And so I'll forever be indebted to it in a strange way. I'm sure I eventually would have seen Tokyo Drift or Fast and Furious or Fast 5. Like, at some point I would have seen these movies, but the nature that surrounded how I became exposed to this series will always be intricately tied to this one that's in Miami, which I've lived in Florida the last 13 years or so of my life. So there's that angle to it as well. Not that I've been to Miami a bunch. There's just a difference in this movie, and that I think makes it unforgettable in a similar way Tokyo Drift is, because Tokyo Drift is in Japan, has this sort of angle. It's segmented in a way from the rest of the franchise. And, you know, I'll always have a soft spot for Too Fast, Too Furious.
They do a good job. We haven't really mentioned that, but I feel like the vibes between this movie and Fast 1 are very distinct from one another. The first one definitely feels, I mean, obviously, and they're shooting them in different locations, duh. But they do a great job of making them feel like they are set in completely different parts of the country. They have different vibes to them in that sense. And obviously they're filming on location. I think the first one was filmed in LA and this one was filmed in Miami. So naturally that's going to come through. But
the culture of the place it's in.
Yes, that too. Yes, very much so. It's hard for me to speak about the legacy too much with this one, again, because I don't have larger context for all the others. So far, I would just say the legacy of this one in my mind is this is just a typical sequel for movie studios back in the day. And I don't know how it's viewed nowadays, but this very much feels like the first one came out. And who releases this? Is it Universal?
Universal.
Universal was like, oh, hey, this movie did better than we thought. Let's greenlight a sequel and get it out within 2 years. And they rushed this out. And that rushing did not lead to a bad movie, but it just feels emblematic of, hey, this thing did pretty well. Let's make another one of those. And then they did that. And they found a story and threw it all together quickly. And they got Paul Walker back, but they couldn't get Vin Diesel back. And then this is the movie that came about as a result. Within the larger context of the series, I'm going to guess this feels somewhat like the Black Sheep. But again, it does a good job of introducing the things that I know will carry forward, which is Brian and Roman's relationship. And then just, I assume how they eventually meet back up with Dom and them has to do with things that happen in this movie. So again, I can't speak too much to the larger legacy of what this film is. Nowadays, I think this film's legacy is probably that it's one of the lower ones on the list that people never rewatch or want to rewatch. But I think on its own, it's totally fine. And it's worth, I don't know if I want to say it's worth revisiting, but again, I did not hate watching it. And I think it's fine if you're totally watching this with a fresh perspective to come in for the first time and experience this. You don't have to dread watching this by any means. So,
Well, I think that wraps up our discussion on Too Fast, Too Furious. Thank you so much for listening. You can follow the show on Twitter at Chapter Select and listen to the rest of our episodes on the Fast and the Furious here and previous seasons. You can follow Logan on Twitter at Moreman12 and his writing over at comicbook.com. You can follow myself on Twitter at MaxRoberts143 and my writing over at MaxFrequency.net. And until next time, adios.
bye-bye.
Chapter Select is a Max Frequency production. This episode was researched, produced, and edited by me, Max Roberts. Season 4 is hosted by Logan Moore and myself. Season 4 is all about the Fast and the Furious. For more on this season, go to chapterselect.com/season 4. Follow the show at Chapter Select and check out previous seasons at chapterselect.com. Don't stop yet. Did you stop?
No.
Okay. I was going to say don't stop yet because there was one other legacy thing I didn't mention, but I felt we were at a natural stopping point, so I didn't want to bring it up. The name of the movie.
Oh, yeah, duh.
Too
We do need to
Fast,
talk about-
Too Furious.
We do need to talk about this.
I'll put this will be a post show. Because
You want to put it post-show?
I'll
Or do
put
you want to splice it into the middle?
No, I'll put post show in. This is
Okay.
The name of the movie is one of the most iconic things from the film.
Yeah, it is.
Holy
This is actually
smokes.
something I remembered the other day after we finished watching it. I was like, I finally seen Too Fast, Too Furious, the film that everybody dupes on all the time with the name. I mean, that's why I told you to open the show with Chapter 2 Select.
It is. I mean, really, they've only come close to repeating that with Fast 5. Great name. And
Furious 7's bad. Fate of the Furious is
had-
bad because they didn't do F8.
They had the opportunity with Fate of the Furious. It just had to be F8. That's it. F8
Fate of the Furious.
of the Furious. That's all they had to do. They were so close.
What
And
is
yet-
the worst title? Probably 9, because the formal
I
title
think
is F9, the
F9.
Fast Saga. That's a horrible
so it's
name.
either 9. I think 4. Fast and Furious.
Fast and Furious. It's pretty
because the only differentiator is the thes.
bad. And you don't know if you're referring to the series as a
Or-
whole or
yeah.
the individual movie. Yeah.
So I think those are probably the weakest. I also think Fast and Furious 6 is pretty plain.
Yes.
It's not. At least Furious 7 chose one of the two. And coming off of Fast 5, it made sense to have a movie with Furious as the main word.
Isn't the next
so-
one Fast X?
Yes, Fast X. Fast 10 is the one in May. I like that title just because it's so ridiculous.
Is this next one a two-parter? Or is there going to be Fast
There are
11?
2 movies. I don't believe it is like a 2-parter in the sense of Deathly Hallows or
It is
Mission Impossible.
though, in the way that they've said that the next two really tie together, but I don't know if they're going to make them individual movies or parts or what the deal is. Or they're obviously individual movies, but I don't know if it's going to be like a Infinity War Endgame type thing where they're two different movies, but they obviously go very much hand in hand.
Yeah, I don't believe so. So the Fast Saga will conclude with the 10th and 11th episodes or movies. But look at this. Although the remaining is produced, less was hired as a replacement a week later. Estimated production budget of $300 million. It ranks as the fifth most expensive film ever made. Holy smokes. Yeah, the name of this movie is awesome.
It is very good, and I'm glad you mentioned it because we absolutely needed to bring it up. I totally forgot about that. That is absolutely hands down the most iconic thing.
That
associated
and
with
We
the movie.
Hungry?
It's
That's
definitely
the
the title, though. The title still has like a sticking place in culture
Mm-hmm.
because it's so
Good.
bad. It's
But
so bad that
awesome.
it's good. It's so bad that it's good. It's
Too
very
fast,
it's very
too
early
furious.
2000s.
It's
For sure.
it's the step aside. Empire Strikes Back. The king of sequel names has been crowned.